I
But
mean,
what is
we
an out-of-control
outsource.
woman? What is this creature? How do we know when we met one?
Look, women have to express aggression somehow, unless you're willing to say that they're not aggressive.
Well, I'm
it's that
asking
the
you.
clinical literature indicates that. It isn't that I think it.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature. I'm interviewing you. What do you
Well,
think?
I'm a psychologist. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it.
In this video, we are going to watch a classic Jordan Peterson debate where many interesting topics are brought up. And it's even more interesting watching this with hindsight and seeing just how well his thoughts have aged. Let's get into the clips.
I believe the fundamental religious truth of the idea that life is suffering. It's suffering because we're mortal and fragile, and because we're also subject to malevolence at our own hands and at the hands of others. It's a constant existential problem, and that can make you bitter and can make you hopeless and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and likely to abuse substances of various sorts as a medication or an escape. It can augur you in a very large number of ways. And I'm suggesting to people that there is a way out of that. And the way out is to confront that forthrightly and to adopt responsibility in your own life and to try to make the world a better place, and that it's necessary to do that. And that if you don't do that, that things go badly. And it's a relief to people to hear that because they know it. They already know it.
So get a grip on yourself.
Well, it's more find something in your life that's so worthwhile doing that the fact that you're going to suffer is justifiable.
But if that something of value were, for instance, for someone to decide that they are a radical feminist or a radical trans campaigner, that would be something of great value in their lives. But these are not positions that I think you think have been hugely
It's generally
helpful.
not of great value in their life, because what they're doing is abdicating their personal responsibility to live by their own truth, let's say, to adherence to an ideology. And I'm not a fan of ideologies. I think they're unbelievably dangerous. And I don't really care whether they're on the left or the right. So to be a feminist or a trans activist or to adopt that group-fostered view of the world, I think is generally a mistake. And I don't think it does people any good. Not usually. And it also allows them to adopt, and this is something else that's gone very wrong with our political discourse, is that it allows people to adopt an unearned sense of moral superiority and also of omniscient knowledge, because an ideology offers you that. And there's just nothing in that's helpful.
So
It just fragments people.
But then what you have isn't an ideology? Or
No, it's not an
Because-
ideology. And
Isn't a strong collection of ideas, in a sense, always an ideology?
No, it's not. It's not. And it's a mistake to think that way, because all that means is that the way that you construe the world is a battleground between different ideologies. And if an ideology is only that which serves a power elite, let's say, which is part of the postmodern neo-Marxist construal, then all it ever is a battle of opinions. And there's nothing underneath that. And it's all power. And that's just not an appropriate way of looking at the world. First of all, there's lots of forces at play that aren't mere power. Competence is one of them, assuming that there are some things that are worthwhile doing. And then with regards to ideology, I wrote a book about that. The first book I wrote is called Maps of Meaning. And it's a description of the relationship between archetypal or mythological thinking, proper religious thinking, I would say, and the parasitical structures that emerge from that, which are basically ideologies. And they can be technically differentiated.
One of my favorite parts of this interview is when Jordan Peterson talks about people who endow themselves with unearned moral superiority. It's a profoundly important issue that we are seeing everywhere today. Moral superiority is something that comes with wisdom, in my opinion. And wisdom is something that is developed over a long period of time, when one has delved deeply into the complexities of the human experience, philosophy, and existential ideas. And I think Jordan Peterson is a man with actual wisdom, and that's why I study his work to develop my own moral framework. But it seems like the activists of today don't want to take the necessary time open-mindedness, introspection, and self-doubt. They are just convinced that their worldview is 100% right because they did a semester of queer theory and now they are the arbiters of what is morally acceptable. Couple that with the fact that deference to authority, something that young people should always be deferring to, is disappearing, demonstrated by the havoc that students are able to cause and the life-altering decisions that children are able to make. And we have an incredibly entitled generation with a distinct lack of wisdom that think that they possess moral superiority to the generations that preceded them. And the last thing I'll say here, I think it's an important topic. Jordan Peterson mentioned that he's not an ideologue. And this ties into the whole conversation about virtue and about morals. And there's an Aristotelian idea that is the golden mean, which means that a virtue normally lies in between two vices. So courage is a really good example. Courage is a virtue that normally lies in between the two extremes of recklessness and cowardice. And I think it's similar in terms of the political sense, that being way too far down the path on either side is a vice. And the virtue is found when you can balance those worldviews, but obviously still take strong positions. That's the goal in my opinion, a wise and balanced view rather than ideology. Now in the next few clips, we're going to look at their conversation about the gender pay gap and feminism. And if you guys know anybody who still thinks that there is a gender pay gap due to oppression, send them this video.
From a social science perspective, the idea of the gender pay gap is it's so poorly formulated that it's almost staggering to me that people can even conceptualize it in this manner. It's not a univariate problem. It's a multivariate problem. Men and women don't make the same amount of money. So we can break it down
and then we can go through
No, not only could we have to.
Good.
And we can't assume that just because in all situations women don't make as much money as men, although there are some situations in which the reverse is true, by the way, that the reason for that is prejudice and oppression. There's many reasons for it. One reason, so there's a book by Warren Farrell, for example, called Why Men Make More, and he outlines like 42 reasons why men make more money than women. One of them is that men are much more likely to take dangerous occupations.
Well,
let's have a go,
if not at 42, at some of the reasons. But perhaps just start by talking a bit more about gender with you, that unfraught territory, which always seems to go well. Do you agree with people who hold that broadly gender is a social construct?
No.
I
don't hold with those people at all.
Why? Yes.
Well, because first of all, that's an axiomatic pronouncement rather than a consequence of the analysis of the empirical data. And I mean, what do you mean a social construct? Genitalia aren't a social construct. Differences in height aren't a social construct. Differences in weight aren't a social construct.
What we deduce from our genitalia is to an extent constructed, right?
Well, because there's environmental and cultural effects on anything that's complex, and that's certainly the case. And differentiating what those are is a very difficult thing to do, but the psychometric work on that has already been done and done well. And
what do you mean by the psychometric work?
I mean,
before we get into the next clip, guys, if you don't mind chucking a like on this video, it would help me enormously with my algorithms. And also, if you're new here or if you haven't subscribed yet, don't hesitate to hit that big red button because you know how much I'd love to have you. Let's keep going.
Psychologists in particular have spent 40 years sorting out an empirically derived model of personality. That's the Big Five model, which is well accepted among personality psychologists in the mainstream, most of who lean left, by the way, by an overwhelming majority. So there's no right-wing conspiracy.
It's a taxonomy, right? It might be five, might be six. I mean, they could be wrong.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting about the taxonomy is that it was atheoretically derived. It's purely a consequence of statistical analysis. And so
I'm not sure where that's taking us on how far gender is socially constructed.
Okay, so the first thing to do is to figure out what the parameters are when you talk about something like gender. So the parameters are, say, parameters of temperament, because you said, well, we're not going to talk about the biology, we're going to talk about what's derived from that. So we might say temperament. Okay, so we know the temperamental dimensions. We know that they differ between men and women, and they differ cross-culturally. But more importantly, this is the crucial distinction.
Well, we don't know, because, I mean, I'm just looking at a piece of recent research on the brain, which concludes there are not two types of brain, and there are other researchers.
Who did the research?
No, it's the New Scientist. Scans prove there's no such thing as the male or female brain, just so you know what you're dealing with.
Nobody who has any sense would ever claim that there was a male and female brain.
Okay.
These differences aren't absolute.
But do you want to, so shall we just take that as a question? Do you want to engage that question on two types of brain, and then we can be a bit clearer
Well,
on the
there aren't
question?
two types of brain, and men and women are more the same by personality than they are different by a substantial margin. There's more similarity than difference.
If there's more similarity than difference.
But that doesn't mean the differences are irrelevant. So let me give you an example. Right. So if you pick two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a
That's
margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right. But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average.
Just quickly, I find it very interesting that he's drawing a picture this whole time, because normally his body language is quite a bit more intense. But in my opinion, the fact that he's so relaxed is actually a credit to the interviewer, Anne McElvoy. And I've seen a few videos where people say he destroyed her and this, that, but I actually think that this was a really good interview. I get the sense that she definitely doesn't agree with him, but is curious about his perspectives and is actively listening and is giving him time and space to air out his thoughts. She's also not interrupting him. The interview wasn't poorly edited, and she wasn't strawmanning him the whole time. So for me, this is a really good example of a respectful disagreement and a fine piece of journalism. But moreover, Jordan Peterson just mentioned one of the points that he has been so brilliant on over the years. Understanding the difference between men and women and why we differ behaviorally. And what I get from this is that much of the argument surrounding the gender pay gap and the patriarchy is built upon a fallacy of oppression. A fallacy that indicates a systemic and intentional inequality, rather than an inequality that derives from nature. Women are paid less, as a general rule, largely due to aspects of their nature that don't predict success in the marketplace. And they're also a lot more vulnerable in many situations due to the makeup of their biology. And we hear about this a lot and the barriers that they face. However, what we don't really hear about is the hurdles faced by men and the way in which male biological predisposition can disadvantage us. As an example, and Jordan Peterson talked about this here, men are far less agreeable, and that's why prisons are filled up with men. Men are also a lot stronger physically. That's why we work all the hard and dangerous jobs. That's why we get sent off to wars to die. And it's interesting when you think about it like this, because for the most part, men won't complain about this, largely because we're duty-driven, but also if there was a men's rights movement that was saying, hey, this isn't fair, we want to be stay-at-home dad, and we want women to be 50-50 and digging the holes and tiling the roofs and unblocking the toilets and laying the bricks and pouring the concrete, nobody would listen, and they would just get laughed at. And fair enough.
Are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the socio-cultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it or some proportion of it. But it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable, and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape.
I mean,
and we didn't fix that till the 60s.
What might irritate some working women, indeed some women, whether they work or not, is you can either sort of look at something like the gender pay gap and sort of pick apart how difficult it is, or you could say, well, let's try to fix this, and let's have an intelligent argument about how we best fix this thing. And the argument that women are self-selecting out of the workplace actually becomes a bit of a roadblock.
Yeah, but women do self-select out of the workplace all the time. Well, if you look at the legal profession, that's absolutely crystal clear. Women are overrepresented at the lower ends of the legal profession, but they stop operating at the high ends in their 30s, and it happens in all sorts of professions, and there's good reason for it. I mean,
the good
what
reason
happens?
being?
Well, because women in their late 20s tend to decide that they don't want to work 80 hours a week. They would rather have a family and devote some time to that, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Another possibly reasonable thing to do is for the child-rearing roles of men and women to come more into balance than allowing, with some trade-offs, life being imperfect, allowing women to come back earlier into the workforce.
Well, yes, but that also assumes that what women want to do is come back.
That's the argument that you put. You put it on the women.
Well, no, not at all. That's not a fair characterization in the least. Your argument is predicated on the idea that the advantage to women is in coming back to the workplace. But many women decide, especially once they have children, that having their children and spending time with them is actually more valuable than going back to the workplace. And that's a reasonable thing to decide. In fact, you might think it's the intelligent thing to decide.
Well, a lot of women do then come back into the workforce, and their pay is then lower.
Well, that's something that you had mentioned earlier, and the fact that women pay a disproportionate price with regards to long-term career earnings if they become mothers. That's a very narrowly focused problem, and it's a problem that might need to be addressed. But that's not the same as the gender pay gap. It's a much more defined problem.
Yes,
and part of the problem is, how do we best...
Can we get you to carry a banner for that part of the feminist crusade then?
Not if it's part of the feminist crusade, no. Because that would mean I'd have to carry a banner for what I regard as a rather reprehensible ideology. But I do.
Overall, feminism is a reprehensible ideology?
Well, what percentage of British women regard themselves as feminists now?
I don't know.
7%.
Well, it depends how you ask a question, I would guess.
Well, no, the reasonable measurements of it estimate there's something like that. It's a very small percentage.
Really?
Yes, really.
Well,
it's a very small minority, even if it's not 7%. And part of the reason for that is...
Would that make it inherently wrong? I mean, I'm not sure it's 7%, and but I think that's one on which we could all go and bandy a bit of research on the isms. But would it necessarily be such a bad idea? I mean, you must have sometimes stuck up for minority rights, even if the idea is right.
Of all, women,
as you say in your book,
women
up
aren't
for
a
what
minority,
you believe.
by the way. They're
Indeed.
actually a majority.
Precisely so. So in that sense...
They're not minority rights that we're talking about here if we're talking about female rights. Have I stuck up for minority rights?
Yes.
I don't see the world
Well, you've
from
said
that
the 7% example would suggest that even a small group within women thought that feminism was... You just decide yourself whether feminism's a good thing or not. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I think it's not a good thing because it plays identity politics games, and I'm not a fan of identity politics games and the collectivist viewpoint. I don't think that men should be set against women. I don't think that we should view the world as a competition between men and women. I don't think we should view history as a structure that pitted oppressed women against the oppressor men. I don't like that story. I think it's a nasty story, and I think it's designed, it's destined to divide us in ways that will not be good. I think it's a story fundamentally predicated on resentment. I don't think it's an accurate view of the way things unfolded in the past. And I don't think women were as powerless or as unable to contribute as the feminists claim they were before, like, 1960.
So Jordan Peterson really gets to show his expertise in behavioral science here. It's very satisfying to watch. He has a near unmatched way of being able to slice through any objections that are brought his way. But he does it in a way that is completely logical and backed by empirical data. And this causes Anne to just have to move on to the next topic, because every time she tries to dig a little deeper, he's just one step ahead of her and is able to handle any objection with absolute ease. But there was a particularly telling part there when Anne said that it's not fair that women get paid less because they take time out to raise children, and that to combat this issue, there should be an evening out of child-rearing roles. Basically, she believes the whole social constructionist feminist crusade worldview, which, by the way, was a bit of a Freudian slip there, a worldview that suggests that women don't really want to naturally raise a family. They would rather have a career instead. And the only reason that this is what they've been doing throughout history is because they were oppressed and forced to do so by cigar-smoking men who had it on easy mode. And this to me is where feminism just goes completely off the rails. These are ideas that are built upon the framework of feminist Marxism, where they believe that the nuclear family is a burdensome and oppressive institution, and that when women are finally able to break free from the shackles of their loving families, the utopian dream of equity will be realized. And I don't know what Anne's worldview is particularly, but I'm assuming that it's somewhere along the path towards that feminist Marxist worldview. But I'm so glad that we have people like Jordan Peterson who are able to dispel these notions in a way that is not only absolutely clinical, but also in a way that pretty much everyone can understand. Now let's watch JP handle some more objections with absolute class.
But when you talk, say, about domestic violence, and there's a sort of thesis behind it, and I'm putting it in a bit of a nutshell here, so feel free to rephrase it, that men are, in the end, if men are pushed too far by a too aggressive a feminism, there will be a backlash, and that there is, there's a sort of undercurrent of violence, be it verbal.
Oh, that's a warning, that's a warning, not a commentary
it's a warning
on the utility
that kind of
that.
suggests that there may be sort of fault in those who push progressivism too far. They will get a backlash. Some people, of course, see that as a bit of a permissive environment for bad behaviour.
Well, people tend to confuse describing the likelihood of something with supporting the fact that it exists. And I'm describing the likelihood of something, not supporting the fact that it exists. If you push too far on the left, you're going to get a backlash on the right. That's how things work. And this is just a derivation of that as far as I'm concerned.
But violence often pops up in your work as something you think drives things. That I think you've said in relations between men are regulated by a background threat of force, and in a sense that's why men have difficulty with women. Is it really so?
No, that's why men have difficulty with women who are completely out of control. But
who should control women?
Well, other women themselves, men, society, just like everyone is controlled. I mean, you're controlled by society, I'm controlled by society, and thank God for that. I mean,
funny. I mean, you described yourself as a liberal earlier, and I think a liberal doesn't think that a society controls women or men.
Well, let's say regulates. I'm a psychologist as well.
But what is an out-of-control woman? What is this creature? How do we know when we met one?
Well, I'm sure that you've met women in your life that acted towards you in a bullying and detestable manner. It's very difficult for women to cope with that because they don't have any real recourse. And female bullying can be unbelievably vicious. And usually that takes the shape of reputation destruction, innuendo, and gossip. It's well documented. It's very difficult to defend. Men do it too, but men no. But the patterns,
disproportionately women, in your view, or not? Sorry.
Yes, disproportionately women. That's what the data indicate. I mean, if
but
men
where is the data on innuendo and gossip?
Well, it's among antisocial behavior among adolescents. It's a well-documented field. So, because people look at aggressive and antisocial behavior in women and in men. And in women, it tends to take the expression of innuendo, gossip, and reputation destruction. And in men, it tends to take the form of outright physical aggression. There's a whole literature on that. It's not a surprise to anyone. This has been known for 30 years. I mean, the rates of antisocial...
I think the idea of the female gossip probably predates 30 years.
Well, it does.
By a long time, but that doesn't... doesn't make it gospel,
but
really,
people
does it?
No, it doesn't. But people have looked at how women express... Look, women have to express aggression somehow unless you're willing to say that they're not aggressive. They tend not to do it physically, not to the degree men do, so they use other channels. And what other channels are there other than physical aggression if you're going to be aggressive? Well, you go after people verbally. You go after them with innuendo and gossip and reputation destruction. And that's how it works.
And just to be clear, that you think that's predominantly a female modus operandi?
It isn't that I think that.
Well,
it's that the clinical literature indicates that. It isn't that I think it.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature. I'm interviewing you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a scientist, and I tend to base my opinions on what I've read in the broad, relevant clinical literature. I'm not making this stuff up. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it.
Man, he is just a master of debating and thinking on the fly. You can see him kind of take a second or so sometimes before responding. And in that split second, he's thinking of these perfect responses. And this, for me, wasn't Anne's finest moment of the interview, because you can really see the feminist start to come out of her in the sense that she rejects all inherent flaws that women might have. Like the fact that men are more physically aggressive and are likely to manifest that in a more violent way than women is just a truism, because this is an observable reality. And if somebody says that, it's not a controversial thing to say. But then when JP says that women are also aggressive, but they manifest it in a different way, such as gossip, innuendo, and reputation destruction, then all of a sudden that's controversial. Funny that. And like, everybody knows that's true. Everybody knows that women gossip more than men. We know that women are far more likely to ruin reputations. I mean, at boys' schools, they'll duke it out, it'll be violent, and then it'll be over. But at girls' schools, I've only heard the stories of what happens when one of the girls gets ostracized from the Mean Girls Club. And then they make her life a living hell for a little while. And then eventually she's friends with the girls again. And these things are borne out by the scientific data, as Peterson points out. So why can't we just be adults and accept these differences? And now onto the last part, where she tries to grill Jordan Peterson about making money, God forbid. And this, for me, really demonstrates that his worldview is concrete. He's not trying to hide anything.
The model that you partly, use to promote your work is the crowdfunding site. So the more you incite a reaction, the more loyal your Patreon site, the more loyal the subscribers become, the more money is raised for causes that you want to promote.
No, that isn't how it works. The reason that, first of all, I give away all my content online for free. So the people who subscribe to Patreon are subscribing to nothing. They're supporting me, and they're not supporting me because of my political stance primarily. They're supporting me because they've watched my videos and they've been helped by them as individuals, and they're hoping that that can happen to a lot of other people.
But if you want to give,
Yeah.
If you say it is self-help and you want to give it away for nothing, then why bring money into the equation at all, and why have this sort of high octane sort of crowdsourcing? Does rely on people coming to you wanting to pledge their money. Why put money into it at all? Isn't this an area where the market might be better left out?
I am an evil capitalist, after all, and I don't really make any apologies for that. I set up my Patreon site mostly out of curiosity, because I've been interested for a long time in how creative people can monetize their creative productions, because that's actually part of my technical interest, because it's very hard to monetize creative productions because they have long-term benefit, but it's hard to show.
Why do you want to monetize?
Well, because I can do useful things with money, and partly because I'm curious, partly because I need to live, partly because my job was at risk for a long while and that's not going to happen to me again, partly because I had to give up my clinical practice because of other considerations, partly because I have a family, partly because I want to build an online university.
Is it about raising money for a cause, or is it about raising money for you?
Well, I don't separate myself from what I'm doing, so I can't really answer that question. I mean, for me, what, am I going to buy a yacht? No. I'm not a luxury kind of guy. I'm not looking to live the high life. I'm 55 years old, for God's sake. What would I do with that? I have lots of things that I would do with some money. One of the things I want to do is build an online university, but it's not the only thing I want to do. And so I would put the money to good use, I suspect, or at least to reasonable use. And the reason that people are providing me with this money, which they don't have to do, is because they hope that I'll continue to do what I'm doing. And that is exactly the reason they're providing it with me. And my leftist critics have been saying for consistently, it's actually quite comical. Well, look at all the money that Dr. Peterson is generating with his Patreon account. It's like, well, I'm not selling anything. All the stuff I do online is free. It's not even advertising supported. So if people want to support me on Patreon because they think that what I'm doing is helpful, then more power to them as far as I'm concerned.
Once again, I absolutely love Jordan Peterson's stance on this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with making money, and a lot of it, when you're providing value to the market. That's the beauty of capitalism. In order to create resources, you have to be providing value. You have to be solving a problem, something that normally helps a lot of people, unless you're a crook. And then if you want those resources to compound, you have to keep on contributing to the market. And monetizing your skills and creating resources through that is incredibly difficult to do. So I cannot stand when people are criticized like this for for making money in an honest way. I would so much rather somebody like Jordan Peterson has a lot of money than the government has that money. And it's a very resentful way to think. Like when I see somebody who's making money, I think, what did they do? What problem did they solve? What value are they bringing? What can I learn from them? So as usual, guys, hope you guys enjoyed that. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And also check me out on all my social medias, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. Check out my other channels. And if you guys want to watch another video, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.